Genesis 20, an exegetical and biblical-theological commentary. Hello everyone and welcome to another installment from Rabbit Room Apologetics. Today we're diving deep into Genesis chapter 20, an exegetical and biblical-theological commentary. I'm Mark Bates. Section 1, Introduction to the Narrative Context. Genesis 20 is positioned at a highly critical juncture within the organically unfolding promise plan of God. Set immediately after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and just before the promised birth of Isaac, this narrative highlights the acute vulnerability of the human agents entrusted with the covenant. The promise plan, God's single, all-embracing word to restore humanity's royal priestly vocation and reclaim the disinherited nations, relies entirely on the preservation of the promised seed. Abraham's lapse into deception regarding Sarah directly threatens the purity of this lineage. Thus, the text demonstrates that the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant rests not on the moral perfection of the patriarch, but on the sovereign, intervening faithfulness of Yahweh to secure the eschatological hope of the world. Section 2, Exegesis of Genesis 20. A. The relapse of faith and the threat to the seed, verses 1 through 2. The repetition of human failure. Abraham journeys to the Negeb and dwells in Gerar. Out of fear for his life, he once again passes off Sarah as his sister, mirroring the earlier deception in Egypt in Genesis chapter 12. This recurrence establishes a clear theological pattern in Genesis, highlighting how patriarchs and their sons frequently follow or depart from the patterns set by their fathers, demonstrating the consistent frailty of the human vessels that carry the divine promise. The rejuvenated matriarch. At 90 years old, Sarah is taken into the harem of Abimelech. This detail implicitly underscores the miraculous physical rejuvenation God had already begun in Sarah to prepare her for Isaac's birth. Her renewed vitality inadvertently attracts imperial attention, placing the promised seed in imminent jeopardy. B. Divine intervention in the heavenly court, verses 3 through 7. The sovereign warning, God directly intervenes by appearing to Abimelech in a dream, declaring him a dead man for taking a married woman. Notably, later Jewish interpretive traditions such as the Targums often identify this manifestation of divine intervention to the foreign king, Abimelech, as the Memra, the word of the Lord, acting as God's personal agent of revelation and protection. Abimelech's defense. The pagan king appeals to his own integrity and innocent intentions, highlighting an ironic contrast where the foreign ruler exhibits a higher standard of functional justice than God's chosen covenant representative. The prophetic vocation. God acknowledges Abimelech's clean hands and reveals that he deliberately withheld the king from sinning. Crucially, God identifies Abraham as a prophet, a Nabi, who must pray for Abimelech's life in verse 7. Even in the midst of his moral failure, Abraham retains his irrevocable ontological and vocational identity within the promise plan as the mediator of divine blessing or cursing to the nations. C. The confrontation and the restoration of order, verses 8 through 18. Abraham's rationale. When confronted by a justly outraged Abimelech, Abraham defends his half-truth, Sarah is his half-sister, and reveals his underlying fear. I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place. Abraham's lack of trust in God's ability to protect him in foreign territory contrasts sharply with God's actual sovereign control over the nations. Restitution and intercession. Abimelech restores Sarah alongside generous gifts of livestock, servants, and silver, vindicating her honor. Abraham fulfills his prophetic role by praying for Abimelech, thereby healing the king's household, which God had previously rendered barren. The episode resolves with the integrity of Sarah's womb definitively protected, ensuring that the child born in the very next chapter, Isaac, is undisputedly the seed of Abraham. Section 3, New Testament Appropriations. The apostolic writers organically connect the historical preservation of the patriarchs to the overarching accomplishment of the messianic promise. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11 through 12, the author of Hebrews emphasizes the miraculous nature of Sarah's conception, pointing to the overarching reality that the preservation of the matriarchs and the birth of the promised son were secured entirely by divine power and faithfulness, a reality Genesis 20 safeguards. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 16, the Apostle Paul explicitly draws upon the preservation of the Abrahamic line, noting that the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed, which ultimately points to Christ. The divine protection of Sarah from Abimelech ensures the unbroken continuity of the lineage that would eventually produce the Messiah. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, Abraham's failure, contrasted with his enduring status as God's designated intercessor, a prophet, points forward to the church's calling. Believers are a royal priesthood and a holy nation tasked with interceding for and blessing the surrounding nations, operating not on the basis of their own inherent perfection, but through the grace of their calling. Section 4, Theological Synthesis. Evaluated through the lens of Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan theology, Genesis 20 operates far beyond a simple moralistic tale about the dangers of lying. It is a narrative of cosmic and covenantal crisis. The Creator's redemptive program, intended to systematically reverse the fractures of Eden, the Watchers, and Babel, is channeled exclusively through the biological lineage of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham's deception threatens to permanently contaminate the promised seed with a foreign imperial seed, thereby nullifying the covenantal architecture of salvation. Yahweh's decisive intervention to protect Sarah proves that the promise plan is upheld by God's relentless fidelity, not human merit. This history grounds the organic unity of Scripture, demonstrating that God actively intervenes in space and time to preserve his concrete promises to ethnic Israel, thereby ensuring that the seed would eventually arrive to reclaim the disinherited nations and restore the cosmic temple. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of Genesis chapter 20. If this blessed you, please subscribe, share, and consider supporting the work here at Rabbit Room Apologetics. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you in his promise plan.